Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Laura Wackerly. I'm an attorney at the law firm Thomas Brown, Bernard & Burke in Rapid City and a member of the South Dakota State Bar CLE Committee. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's events. Do you or another state bar member or law student you know have a drug or alcohol problem or struggle with depression or anxiety? Lawyers Concern for Lawyers is a confidential and independent resource for South Dakota lawyers, law students, and their families. Your referral or visit with LCL is strictly confidential and privileged. Call Becky Porter for more information at 605-391-5191. Becky is an LCL member and your communications with her are likewise confidential and privileged. You can also call 988 to reach a mental health professional or the Sand Creek Employee Assistance Program at their confidential crisis line, 1-800-243-5744. Mental health professionals at both numbers are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Today's presentation will last approximately an hour. You'll have an opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat feature of Zoom. You may also send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect and address them during the questions and answer section at the end of today's presentation. Thank you to the State Bar of South Dakota and CLE Inc. for their support with today's program. I would now like to introduce our presenter. Julie Johnson is an attorney from near Aberdeen. She is the product of a 3-generation family business and has owned several small businesses along the way. When she graduated from USD Law, she returned to Aberdeen to practice for about 7 years. She has also served as the South Dakota Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Revenue, as an administrative law judge, and as president and CEO of the Industry and Commerce Association of South Dakota, now State Chamber. She eventually returned home to run its growth initiative called Absolutely Aberdeen and Prairie Vision. Julie has taught business law and related courses in South Dakota higher education system. She has been an active member of several state bar committees over the years, including currently serving on the in-house counsel, administrative law, and workers' compensation committees. In all those years, she has had a role at the South Dakota Legislature wearing some form of lobbyist badge. She is perhaps the longest-standing woman lawyer lobbyist at the South Dakota Legislature. Julie monitors economic development, housing, workforce, HR, employment law, tax, regulatory, and business issues at the legislature every year. And with that, I give you Julie Johnson for today's presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. Nice to be with you today. Thanks for joining us. What a great opportunity to see you all in action, to hear your questions, and to try to act on your needs for information. Let's see if I can get these slides to work. Well, there we go. So I'm putting my contact information up front, johnson2@abe.midco.net. If I slide over an issue a little too rapidly, you need more detail, you have a difference of opinion, any of that is legal here. Feel free to use that, and I'll have it up at the end as well so that you can follow up if helpful to you. I'm doing the slides backwards. So what will we talk about? Well, I'll give you a little disclaimer. I wouldn't be a good lawyer if I didn't do that. Share a few dates, who serves, and then look at a few issues that you might need to know or your clients might need to know at the end of the day, like how a few key budget issues ended up, how some tax issues ended up, housing, economic development, water, workforce, childcare, foreign governments, very important one, and a few others. And then to tell you a little more about what's next, what's coming next, so you can keep your eye on those items as well. I'm going backwards here. Okay, so I'm licensed to practice law in South Dakota, but I'm not your lawyer. And what's hard for me also is I don't know all of the fact patterns out there. I've done this for so long that I know many of the possibilities, but don't assume that I knew all of them and may not have gotten my interpretation or your need to know exactly right. I'm not an expert in all these areas. Here I am an expert in a few of these. So I'll try to limit myself to those things that you can count on. How I slice and dice the issues, in other words, how I organize them, may not quite be the way that you organize them in your heads, So feel free to put them in the right categories in your heads as well. Give you a few dates. So the legislature went home after veto day on March 27, which is always a big deal in my world. They met and they went home, is a big deal in my world. In April, both on March 27th and then in April, the board of directors essentially for the legislature, they call it the LRC Executive Board, they got to work. They decided what they were going to do, what issues they're going to work on over the course of the summer, and I'll share a few of those with you in a few slides. But remember, we'll be back at this again when the governor presents her budget address on December 5. We'll start this process all over again. So just about the time we thought we'd caught up and figured out what they did in 2023, we'll be trying to figure out what they're trying to do in 2024. They did set their calendar for next year. It starts on January 9th through March 7th and veto day on March 25. They're using 38 legislative days again next year as they did this year. In fact, if you're one of those that likes to go with your community's legislative day, or you like to come out with clients on their legislative day, or any of those kinds of things, the schedule looks a lot like it did this year. So a lot of 4-day weeks, although not all of them. Notice also a really important point I don't want to miss. March 26th of next year is the candidate filing deadline. If somebody wants to serve in the legislature, they have to file their petitions to serve by March 26th of next year. So right after veto day, we will know who the candidates are for next year. So it's not too soon to start thinking about teeing up someone appropriate in your universe to run. They don't have to start circulating petitions until January 1. But it's here before you know it, and our ability to prepare people gets more complicated every year. So factor that in. Note to self, we're going to be looking for candidates here anytime now. Now that's the deadline for Republican or Democratic candidates. Independent candidates have until April 30th. So who serves? Well, we had a record year for women. I had to note that, didn't I? 31 women are serving in the legislature. That's a record. We've been breaking records in that category for the last few years, but once again, that record was broken this year. And there are 9 lawyers in the legislature. We lost 2 very seasoned retired judges in this new crop, but nonetheless, we have some good ones. In the Senate, we have Senator Mike Dietrich from Rapid City. He's the Assistant Majority Leader. Senator Lee Schoenbeck from Watertown is the President Pro Tem. Senator David Wheeler from Huron is a Majority Whip. Then in the House, also well represented at the top, is Representative Mike Stevens from Yankton. He's the Speaker Pro Tem of the House. Representative Will Mortensen from Fort Pierre is the Majority Leader. Representative Tony Van Huysen from Sioux Falls, Representative John Hanson from Del Rapids, Representative Scott Odenbach from Spearfish, and Representative Bethany Soy from Sioux Falls are the 9 lawyers. And you can see that they're very well represented in the leadership spots. So keep your eye on those. They're pretty important names to know. A few perspectives about what we were dealing with this year. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we had 35 new legislators. That's a lot. So there's some issues that took a little more work or a little more backgrounding to help them along, or maybe we'll take a little more work to bring them back the second year. The legislature, the House and Senate leadership did a remarkable job of working together. They deserve a lot of credit. They found great ways to work together, find solutions on issues they might not have necessarily agreed about originally, to work through all 451 bills, 241 in the House and 210 in the Senate. There were 11 joint resolutions introduced. That is the mechanism by which you get something on the ballot. Only one of those passed, and I'll show you that here in a few slides. So once again, their website is sdlegislature.gov. If you need to look up anything I'm talking about today, I will suggest to you it is not as Google searchable as you and I have gotten used to. So there are times when you're looking for something, you say, I heard there was a bill on thus and so, and you can't find it. It's not, And it's very, it doesn't work quite as well as you and I are used to anymore, but nonetheless, that is the website. Reach out to me if we can help you find something there. A new, kind of a new cause for attention comes in the executive order category. So not all lawmaking this year has happened at the legislature. There's several executive orders. I will bring a few of them to your attention that I think practitioners need to know about. It is in a unique spot in the state's website. I'm sure many practitioners have never been there before, but it's under the Secretary of State's website. And this happens to be the link, if you can see that, sdsos.gov, general-information, executive actions. So they're buried in kind of a funny place on the state's website. But nonetheless, with the executive order business we've had this year, practitioners will need to know how to find it and how to stay in touch with it. It's not as friendly that way. So I'm going to bring up a couple for your attention today. So it's not a pure legislative presentation today. We also have to pay attention to a few executive orders. So taxes were front and center. This whole conversation began with the governor's promise to repeal the sales tax on groceries. She announced that late in her campaign. That effort failed. There was also an attempt to reduce the property tax for homeowners, owner-occupied residential properties. That also failed. In the end, they did reduce the state sales tax. So there was some very thoughtful conversations about all of this. However, I think you would have been impressed. So let me bring you to how the sales tax reduction works. It's contained in House Bill 1137, if you need the details, and you might. So it reduces the state's sales tax, not the city sales tax, from 4.5% to 4.2%. That's an unusual number. Practitioners may have all kinds of contractual and other documents that are driven by things like this, and we'll all have to pay attention to this. Be sure that our documents can keep up with this. It does have a 4-year sunset clause. In other words, it expires on June 30th, 2027, unless other legislative action is taken. So it goes away and restores the sales tax rate to 4.5%. Unless there's other legislative agreement. Notice what's important, I think, also for our practitioner friends is that it's effective July 1 of this year. It will come up quickly. If you have documents that need to reflect this, if you have clients who need to incorporate this effectively into their business models, et cetera, we'll want to pay attention to this quickly by July 1. So how to implement the reduced sales tax? Fortunately, the Department of Revenue got right on it and have issued some questions and answers, some frequently asked questions pieces on their website. Those two are not easy to find, but they're under the dor.sd.gov website for business taxes. And there's a legislative update. It's very hard to find on there. But they have a fairly good list of things to think through. And of course, this will vary for your clients. Some clients may be on different accounting methods that will change how they implement the reduced sales tax effectively for the July 1 implementation date. The folks I know at the Department of Revenue in this particular agency love to get questions from from folks like you. So if any of you are stumped and left without enough information for your clients or you to succeed, I'm sure they'd love to take your call. One other big tax reduction, which is rather understated, is the one we know as the reemployment assistance tax. It used to be known as the unemployment insurance tax. This is the fund that pays for unemployment insurance benefits, now called reemployment assistance benefits. So this is a big deal, was the first bill to be signed by the legislature this year, House Bill 1011. It is an $18 million tax reduction across the board for employers in South Dakota. This is a big deal. The agency gets some credit for bringing this forward because they detected that there was more money than they needed in the trust fund that the state holds for these purposes. So they get a lot of credit for this. And this takes effect January 1. So we have to sync that up with whatever our clients' needs might be. I know that there are employers out there trying to figure out what that does to their budget for the next calendar year. So that's House Bill 1011. In the budget process, the legislature is particularly the Joint Appropriations Committee engaged in some very in-depth, high-quality conversations about how much revenue can we really expect to have next year. Is this surplus money thing that we're experiencing, is it reliable into the future? Is it an anomaly? Are we going to get a recession? Can we count on those dollars into the future, et cetera? In the end, they decided they think they can count on about a 3.8% increase. So keep that in mind if you happen to have clients who have contracts based on revenue increases, et cetera. That's the number the state picked, and they will monitor that like a hawk all throughout the entire process. They do not want to do budget reductions if they do not have to. I've been there when that happens. You don't want to be there either when that happens. So the legislature also did some very thoughtful work in and around implementing Medicaid expansion, which passed on the ballot, the last general election ballot. So they worked very hard. And there are a couple of members on the committee who are rather expert in this area anyway. So they do believe they have the money in the right places to be sure that Medicaid expansion can be paid for as the populace wanted it to be. So hopefully that is true. Of course, that also has to sync up with what the feds are doing here, but they did some rather remarkable work. I think you would have all been proud of that. Then they get to make 3 big decisions every year about how much Medicaid providers will be increased, if at all, how much K-12 education will be increased, if at all, and how much state employees will get in terms of increases. And I've learned the hard way that the private sector really needs to know these numbers at the end of the day, because you may have formulas, you may have contracts, business relationships of all kinds that also need to move in sync with these numbers, or need to know what they are at least. So Medicaid providers at the end of the day did finally move to a methodology that reimburses them for 100% of their costs. Now, I find it absolutely crazy that in today's environment, they weren't reimbursed at 100% of their costs, but going forward, they will be. This is a monumental. This is a really big deal. Plus, then the legislature set aside a 5% increase in addition to that. So this kind of recalibrates where the Medicaid providers have been the last few years. Monumental work. K-12 education got a 7% increase, and state employees across the board got a 7% increase, plus some very targeted positions got some increases. In fact, there's a whole list of which job categories got targeted positions. If you need that list, I can pull it out and send it to you. And I've learned over the years that the private sector really likes to know what these numbers are, so they know what they're doing with their own workforce as well. Teacher salaries is another one I've learned the last several years is really important to know once we recalibrated how the teacher salary and state contribution to education works. So teacher salaries, the minimum teacher salary was set at $59,659.25, and that begins on July 1. All of these increases begin on July 1. That is the state's fiscal year. The legislature also made some key investments in a few important areas, which could be important to us as well. They made some good investments in mental health, and they've tried to do that the last few years as well. Suicide prevention. I don't believe I'd ever watched them do that before, but that's a really important thing. Adult day services also got a nice investment. If you were to watch the whole budget process, which I kind of do, it's mostly the governor's proposed budget with some of these exceptions in this list. And then there's a lot of money for prisons because we need some prison replacements. Housing infrastructure. I won't go too far into this. I could probably spend an entire day on this. But a really important bill passed, and that was Senate Bill 41. It reinterpreted a bill that passed last year that allocates $200 million, $50 million in federal money, and $150 million in state general funds for housing infrastructure. Clarified legislation from a year ago. How does it work? It allocates it to communities of certain sizes. You can use it on 1/3 of the total project cost, and it defines project cost, various kinds of housing, because we learned the hard way that different kinds of housing are the different kinds of needs in communities across the state. If you're a community over 50,000, you can only get a loan or a grant. If you're under 50,000, you might be able to get a loan and a grant. Half of those dollars can go to loans and half will be to grants. The Housing Development Authority, which has a lot of technical expertise in this realm, was vested with the authority to implement it. They are going through the rulemaking process now. If you, I'm deeply involved in this one. I represented many of the housing groups. If you have specific questions on this, feel free to reach out. There are some very specific definitions about infrastructure throughout the bill, including all the different kinds of things that might be considered to be infrastructure. I won't read those to you. So the Housing Development Authority Board of Commissioners did meet on May 2 and announced the draft rules and set a public hearing for May 31, which I will attend. And then, so hopefully their interpretation of how all of that should be implemented will go forward shortly thereafter. It would have to go to the next step, which is the LRC's, the Legislative Research Council's Rules Review Committee for approval to put them into action. And they're hoping for a June 13th date. We'll stay tuned. We're hoping that this whole process is back on track. It got a little derailed and I'll spare you all of that, but we think it's back on track now. And if you have any detailed questions or your clients do, feel free to reach out to me. I may know the answer. A lot of economic development related pieces, and we know that people throughout our profession are deeply involved with local economic development efforts on the developer's side, the municipality's side, the nonprofit economic development organization side. A lot of our profession are deeply involved in this. So one bill that did pass at the initiative of the economic development professionals is Senate Bill 120. There is an exemption in the current law of property owned by a development corporation, which development corporations hold a lot of land, waiting for the next big employer to join them in their community or the next big investments. So they were able to increase the exemption in the property tax for that land from $750,000 to $2.5 million. That takes effect July 1. You can't use the exemption if you're renting out the land. So if it's ag land and you're renting it out, you can't use the exemption on that. We are awaiting interpretation from the state about how they will roll this out. And clearly that fits into the rest of the property tax system. A couple of quickies on here as well. Ag protection. The ag protection laws were enhanced in House Bill 1090. So neighboring landowners, etc., may or may not have as many reasons to complain about something that's going on next door. If you are in that business or closely related to it, please read the details in House Bill 1090. Oops, backwards. Visitor industry. There are a few opportunities going on in communities around the state put together by the State Department of Tourism. You may hear about it in your local communities, and many of these groups are administered by a Convention and Visitors Bureau or a Visit Rapid City or a local chamber, whoever does this for the community. They were made eligible for what's called a destination marketing grant. I believe they are learning now about the possibilities there, and I know many in this at this table today serve in volunteer capacities with those groups or do a lot of free legal work for this industry sector. So all of this is good. There are some remaining federal money, ARPA dollars, at the Department of Tourism, and hopefully that can be deployed wisely as well while those dollars are still available. Foreign ownership. Okay, I breathe in very deeply on this one. There were 3 bills introduced at the legislature, and then some executive orders came out. So this is a complex topic. It started with a bill brought by the governor, Senate Bill 185. Every ag group in the building opposed it. I believe that's a fair statement. So 185 went to heaven. But there was another bill that did pass, and you need to pay attention to this if you have clients or you represent people who sell things or perform services for the state. You'll want to read Senate Bill 189, which did pass. This will be administered by the Bureau of Administration. The state may not execute a contract with China or with companies that do business with China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. So you will want, if your clients are even close to the business of providing services to the state or selling things to the state, you will want to be sure you read the details in Senate Bill 189. It prohibits purchasing agencies, which typically may be the Bureau of Administration or others, from executing contracts, et cetera, that are owned or with companies that are owned or controlled by certain foreign entities or governments. I don't want to read this to you, but this is one of those you have to read to really understand how this may come up to bite you and your clients if you're not aware of it. It doesn't include someone who's a citizen or legal resident of the US or individual foreign nationals. So the purchasing agency may not execute a contract with them. And if the state is issuing an RFP requesting services or stuff, they have to give notice that the entity has to certify that they do not do business with those countries. If they find out that they do business with those countries, the state may terminate that contract, or they can waive it if compliance is not possible, supplies or sources are unique or unavailable, or there's no other market participant. If a company violates this, they may be suspended from doing business with the state or being debarred from the state. This is a bill you have to read in detail and put your head in the game of the context with your clients and their fact patterns to really know whether this impacts them. So that's Senate Bill 189. So let's look then at another one. It turned out that when this conversation emerged about evil foreign governments, depending on the day you were having your vocabulary lesson, we really didn't know in South Dakota who owned what. Did somebody from somewhere else own anything in South Dakota? So the Registered Agents Act was amended in House Bill 1189. So it's now an annual report requirement, whether the entity owns any ag land or whether it has any foreign beneficial interest by a foreign government or state-owned enterprise of a government. It doesn't name the countries. So it doesn't decide today that this country is evil and that country is not. It wants to know all foreign entities that own any ag land. It is effective July 1, and this is an amendment to SDCL 59-11. So once again, you'll want to read this in the context of your clients and their fact patterns. Oops. And this year, legislating by executive order became all the rage. There were, I'm lifting up 4 of them for your edification. Executive Order 2023-02. And if you were to go into the Secretary of State's website and actually find these, they're hard to find. Okay, remember I told you that they're hard to find. It would be labeled cybersecurity. It's the TikTok ban. And I have a few notes on that coming up here. Another one to bring to your attention is 2023-07, which is about medication shortages in China. The next one is Executive Order 2023-4, which has to do with the Second Amendment. I have the details on that coming up as well. And then 2023-6 has to do with 10 Cent Holdings, which is a Chinese holding company. So let me give you a little more detail on these to accentuate why I wanted to be sure you knew about some of this. In the one involving the Second Amendment, some of the recitals include that denying financial services is discriminatory, and that it hinders the ability to keep and bear harms. If you deny financial services to someone in the Second Amendment world. The executive order also defines financial institution as a bank, insurance company, credit union, savings and loan, investment trust, or other organization held out to the public as a place of deposit of funds, medium of savings or collection, and currency exchange. So a very specific definition of financial institution. You'll want to put that in the context of your client and their fact patterns as well. And that it has $100 billion or more in total assets. So you might have to ask some hard questions there. And so what happens then is if they attempt to contract with the state for $100,000 or more, the executive branch cannot execute a contract that discriminates against the right to keep and bear arms with a financial institution of these descriptions. You have to certify that you don't do this when you complete the contract with the state or submit your RFP. If you don't, if you violate it, you may be debarred. And any RFP must also certify all of this. This isn't a law school test question. You'll want to go online for kicks and giggles and just read this and see what you make of it and see how it plugs into your operations and the things you have to look out for your clients every day. That's the one involving the Second Amendment. The one involving the medication shortage in China is fairly new. It orders the South Dakota Department of Health to determine the extent of reliance on foreign sourced medications or raw materials and identify all of the opportunities to mitigate those shortages in South Dakota and report back by June 12th. So you represent anybody that deals in the medication world. Be sure you're involved in this. It's going to happen relatively quickly, and what happens, I don't know. They're going to identify all the opportunities to mitigate those shortages in South Dakota. 10 Cent, and this has to do with TikTok and such social media from evil foreign governments. So as Executive Order 2023-06 says that no employee or agency of the state may download, use, or visit on government-owned devices, cannot visit any of these things, but 10 Cent Holdings have. And no person who contracts with the state can do so either. I don't know that most people know that's in there. And it creates a public list of all of these things. I don't know how this will be enforced, but many of us in our profession want to think this through in great detail for our clients. Oops. There were a few other business issues. The other culture war bills died, so I won't go into two of those, but I'll tell you what, those could be a law school test question in themselves. If you go online and read House Bill 1207 and 1208, you try to figure out what those say and do. Wow. And that's essentially what I said when I testified. I can't tell my clients what these bills do. The Uniform Commercial Code, never have I seen this happen before. House Bill 1193, the upgrade to the Uniform Commercial Code was vetoed and sustained the veto. So, and the bankers took much of the lead on this, very disappointed. They'll have to go back. I've never seen the Uniform Commercial Code be rejected by the South Dakota Legislature, so we'll want to stay on top of things like that. Non-competition agreements. House Bill 1185 removed nearly all non-competition agreements for nearly all health professionals. Go in and you represent anybody in that universe. Be sure you read the whole list of everyone for whom you cannot have a non-competition agreement. It's House Bill 1185, and they are voidable if you have them. Once again, that takes effect July 1. Indian arts and crafts got a more artful definition in House Bill 1101 so that they're not misrepresented. And an attempt to provide more privacy for certain records in the workplace is going back to square one again. I think you'll see this come next year, but only with a lot of work through the interim. This came from the Attorney General's office, but it wasn't ready for prime time. Backwards. Okay, water. Some of you may be involved in water investments. The legislature continued some very strong water investments, including some that my clients were involved in. And I think you'll see more of this in the future. If you and your clients want to know more, feel free to reach out to me. Some other workforce issues we haven't already talked about. We talked about housing already. Professional licensure. I have a slide specifically on that, Senate Bill 76. This legislature, once again, made a nice investment in the tuition freeze in the budget for higher ed and technical ed. Both got a tuition freeze in the budget. National Guard tuition will also be reimbursed at 100% of tuition into the future. Opportunity scholarships were increased. Career and technical education got a nice investment in it through Senate Bill 59. Rural health recruitment, which is a process the legislature started several years ago to encourage placement of certain rural health professionals around the state. And the state does incentivize that, reimburses tuition for those if they stay located in those rural communities for certain periods of times. They continued their investment in that. And dentists were added to the rural health recruitment process. Professional licensure. For any of you who have any occupational license that's covered by Title 36 of the code, a whole bunch more were added to at the business of allowing the state to expedite professional licensors in those categories to come to South Dakota from other states. Now, they did not take away the authority of those boards or commissions to look at those credentials, but they are expediting those licenses into South Dakota. So I pulled out a few of them and put them on the screen, not all of them. EMTs, water and wastewater operators, teachers, administrators, etc., commercial pesticide operators. The list is long. You'll want to go in and look at it to be sure that your clients know that this opportunity is presenting itself. And then you'll want to touch base with their professional licensing entities to be sure you know how that procedure is actually going to work. It is designed to help people get into South Dakota a little more effectively to meet our workforce challenges. That's effective July 1. Apprenticeships. So about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the state also announced a new program your clients may or may not know about yet. It's called starttodaysd.com. It is paid apprenticeships for a plethora of various occupations. The governor allocated $7+ million for paid apprenticeships of up to $15,000. I don't believe all the details are in place, but you may have clients that don't yet know this, and as an opportunity to be involved in this rare opportunity. And they're encouraging occupations and workplaces to think creatively beyond what is typically considered an apprenticeship, which is some very skilled trades only. So we'll see if this can help our workforce environment. StartTodaySD.com. Childcare. I won't go too far into this, but some of you may do all kinds of things with your childcare entities in your communities. The governor began some of this conversation in her speech by announcing a few things, including trying to be sure that health coverage was provided to childcare workers. That has not yet been determined or announced. I think there's a ways to go yet before they can figure out the details there. The state did accept grant applications for $12.5 million in federal dollars for expansions and startup daycares and $3 million for family daycare. We're awaiting news on some of those applications now. You may have some of those in from your communities. There is federal money remaining in this pot. We'll see what they decide to do with that once some of these announcements are made. There's also, they're accepting applications or RFPs, proposals for a childcare study in South Dakota. Now, we know that several communities are farther ahead on the study business than the state may be. If you want to be sure your community has a seat at that table because you already done some of this homework for them, reach out, give me a note. We'll try to be sure they're included in all of that. They're also doing a lot of work about the regulations about childcare standards right now. There was a public hearing just the other day regarding some proposals from the Department of Social Services. I have not yet heard the outcome of that. Perhaps you have, but a lot of work remains in and around the childcare subject. Oops. Employment law. Okay, I'll touch on the ones that I didn't already touch on. The governor had some parental leave proposals, which she launched in her speech. Those were not passed, but she did enter into an executive order declaring that state employees would be eligible for 12 weeks of 100% parental leave. So she did that by executive order. I've touched on some of these as well. Some of these failed, so I won't spend a lot of time on all of those. Medical marijuana, which has been a real struggle to be sure we understand how that fits into the law and into the workplace. Senate Bill 1 did pass. It adds some medical provisions to the list that for which medical marijuana would be considered a lawful use, including post-traumatic stress. There's also an important bill that passed regarding pharmacy and pharmacy managers. I am not an expert on that one. I'll be real upfront about that. If you have those in your workplace, we can get you connected to some people who know those details. Going backwards here. Well, a couple other quick tools you can use. The business of public comment periods at public meetings, city councils, county commissions, school boards, etc. Was clarified just a little bit in Senate Bill 162. If you are one of those that has to go into those once in a while and share some information or ask good questions, that was clarified just a little bit in Senate Bill 152. And golf carts on roads was also clarified, and I forgot to put the bill number there, so my apologies for that. So what are they going to work on over the course of the summer? Many of you will want to be engaged in parts of these. Counties, the financial challenges and requirements of counties are really coming under the gun, and the legislature is working on finding some solutions to all of that. They have their first committee hearing I think in early June. I forgot the date. But they put a nice committee together of people who have some expertise in this, and they'll be working on that. So you and your clients may want to bring issues or opportunities to them as they try to figure out how to take care of the counties in all of this. Long-term care was the other selected study from the legislature this year, how to create a sustainable model for long-term care. Very concerned about long-term care facilities closing in places around South Dakota. As I might have mentioned, there'll be some work still going on kind of behind the scenes in and around childcare, a very important topic to resolve. There'll be some behind the scenes work on water as well, and perhaps even airports. Ballot measures. One ballot measure did pass, and that is the measure that takes out the he when referring to governor, et cetera. So it makes everything more sex neutral in the Constitution. That did pass the legislature. It will appear on the ballot next year. There are a few being circulated at various stages in that entire process. Adult use marijuana, single subject legislation, open primaries, parental rights, vaccine mandates, abortion rights, and food tax are in various stages of circulation for the ballot for next year. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Be quiet on this end. I'm not always seeing what's going on in the chat here, but I'll allow our very capable helpers to help us out on this regard. What kind of questions are out there today? What can I help you with?
Thanks, Julie. That was really comprehensive. I learned a lot in the last 45 minutes. I did have a few questions while other people are maybe thinking about what they might want to ask. I guess my first question, I don't have any sense of what the answer to this is, but have you noticed an increase in executive orders in the last few years?
Just in the last year. Yes.
It's interesting. What do you attribute that to? Is that just a tension between the governor's office and the legislature, or what's your view on why that would be?
There's other governors around the country that are doing things like this, and I think there's some attempt to keep up with that kind of thing, or if it didn't pass at the legislature, see if they couldn't make it stick through an executive order. I won't go too far into the politics of all of that.
Fair enough.
But it's definitely being used more, and it used to be just, declaring Julie Johnson Day at the legislature or something like that. It's much broader than that now.
Interesting. Very interesting. I did have one more question about the UCC with regard to House Bill 1193. Do you have any sense of whether, I'm somewhat familiar with that, not very familiar though. Do you have any sense about whether the UCC definition of money has been passed in other jurisdictions?
It has. It has. And that was one of the arguments we used, is we didn't want to be the last state standing, because our economic development climate requires us to be more accessible across state boundaries, and we didn't want to create that barrier. I can't quote that right off the top of my head right now, though.
Fair enough. Does anybody else have any other questions? All right, seeing none, thank you, Julie. If those in attendance have additional questions, you're free to contact the State Bar at info@sdbar.net, and we will get them directed to our presenter. Once you leave today's webinar, we would appreciate it if you would review the survey and complete it. We would appreciate any feedback that you have. On behalf of the State Bar of South Dakota, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Julie, very much.
Thank you.